politics isn't a spectrum. It's not the left here and the right here. It's a horseshoe. And the extremes are the ones who are furthest away from the center. The more you can broaden out the center, the more the center can dominate politics, the more you can have those arguments and have them be positive.
Welcome to Radio Davos, the podcast from the World Economic Forum that looks at the biggest challenges and how we might solve them. This week we're talking about politics and democracy. As populists are on the rise in many countries, how should the moderates respond? We hear from the author of a new book called The Centre Must Hold.
If populists and extremists try to govern and try to campaign through fear, there's no point us competing with that. We're never going to be able to out-fear them. And so what we should be doing is offering an alternative, and that alternative is a message of hope.
Author Yair Zivan says that centrism must not be defined as simply being the midpoint between two extremes. It's not the lukewarm water of politics trying to maintain a status quo, but is something far more radical.
Centrists absolutely aren't about status quo. I think the idea of pragmatism and moderation and nuance and complexity and seriousness in politics is as far from the status quo as possible right now, and that's one of the reasons we see so many challenges.
Subscribe to Radio Davos wherever you get your podcasts, or visit wef.ch/podcasts, where you'll also find our sister programmes Meet the Leader and Agenda Dialogues. I'm Robin Pomeroy at the World Economic Forum, and with this look at politics and democracy, we test the words of the poet W.B. Yeats, who wrote, "Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold."
The centre must hold comes from William Yeats's poem. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
This is Radio Davos. Welcome to Radio Davos, and this week we're talking about democracy. In a year when billions of people are voting on the shape of their government, it often feels like politics is more polarised than ever. So my guest today is Yair Zivan, the editor of a new book called The Centre Must Hold. Yair, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm impressed that you pronounced my name right.
I didn't even ask you before, did I?
No, it's the first
You have put together this book, which I read with rapt interest, I have to say.
Thank you.
You're the editor of it more than the author of it, because it's a collection of essays by political thinkers. I'm going to ask you in a second to describe what the book's about and what you're aiming, why you've done it and why you've done it now. But I'm just going to read one sentence from, you allow yourself to write the conclusion to the book. And it says, this book is a call to arms, centrists of the world unite. And this is, I guess there's an element of irony there, because this idea of centrism being this passionate thing that a group of committed people can gather around is something that's really tackled in this book. So I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But just tell us what the book is about and why you've written it now.
So, like you said, the book is called The Centre Must Hold. So it comes from William Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. That's the headline. And there's two lines in that poem that really strike me, and I think are the motivation behind the book. And they touch on the centrists of the world unite, which you're right, of course, is ironic. And they are the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And those two lines of that poem should resonate with all of us today. And when I think about the best and the worst in politics, the worst for me today in politics are the extremes. And they have passionate intensity and they have a clarity of message. I think they're wrong about almost everything. But they have that passionate intensity about them, which I think the centre has lacked. So the idea of this book was really to say, wait, from my personal experience, I think there is a thing called political centrism. I think it's coherent. I think I know what it means. I think I know how to describe it, and I try and do that in the introduction and in the conclusion to the book. But it's not enough if just I think it. And so I started reaching out to people who I thought were political centrists as well, and asked them to write essays on different things. And throughout the book, you'll see that there are essays on a range of topics, whether that's climate change or economics or the developing world or technology. We cover the whole range of political issues. And I asked each of them to write about centrism and something else to see if it became coherent. And I'll be honest, and I don't know if this is such a good idea, but every time a new essay came in, I slightly felt myself nervously opening it, worrying that somebody who I thought shared my political worldview was going to write something that made absolutely no sense to me and sounded completely different. And actually what happened was, it was clear that the essays were incredibly coherent. I had more than one occasion when I'd open an essay and I'd realize that they were quoting somebody else who had written an essay for the book without knowing that they were also a contributor. So these people who I gathered who had never been put together in any sort of framework. This is the first time they're all together in one book. We're feeding off each other already, I think. And so the idea of the book was to say, wait, there is this thing called centrism. We've never articulated it before. We've never tried to put it all together in one place to show that it works. And it's time that we did that for two reasons. One, because centrism is really important to the world that we live in. It plays a key role in politics across the world. And two, because it's not doing anywhere near as well as I think it should be doing. I think centrism should be much stronger, should be much more effective across the democratic world at least. So those were, I guess, the two main reasons for writing it.
So give us an idea for anyone who's not read the book of, a handful of the contributors. Who are the kind of people who are writing here?
So we have really a whole range of people from across the world. We have Tony Blair has written for the book. Michael Bloomberg has written for the book. Matteo Renzi, the former Prime Minister of Italy. Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister of Australia. Yair Lapid, former Prime Minister of Israel. And full disclosure, also my boss. So, we have those sorts of groups of politicians. Steven Sejourne, who's the Foreign Minister of France today. Marco Buschmann, the Justice Minister of Germany. So active politicians in the world today. We have some incredible thinkers and writers from across the world. Andres Velasco from the LSE has written a really powerful piece, I think. Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post and Bill Galston from the Wall Street Journal and Brookings. Micha Goodman and Polly Bornstein from Israel, from where I'm from, who I think have written some fantastic essays as well. So the idea was to get really as wide a range of people as possible. And I'm really pleased that we've managed to do that. And Arnie Duncan, I should mention as well, who was Obama's education secretary, has written about education and centrism. So a real range. There's scope for a second book, though.
Right. We should also mention Borge Brender, president of the World Economic Forum.
So I was going to get to that separately.
We can come back to him.
Yeah, we should.
The first thing that struck me, with the title of the book, is just, what is centrism? Because presumably you've got people on the right. We need to define what that is. People on the left, and then the centre is a midpoint between them. If that is the definition of centrism, it's almost not even a thing, is it? So I don't think that is your definition, is it? What is centrism?
So I think what you defined just now is the middle. And the middle is a geographic point, right? You take a spectrum of left and right, you decide where you think the mean voter is and where the middle point is, and you place yourself there. There are plenty of politicians that do that, but that isn't centrism. And that isn't what being a centrist politician or centrist figure is about. Centrism, I think, has some very clear principles and values which tie it down. And actually, when centrism defines itself and articulates itself properly, then the rest of the political spectrum has to adapt to centrism rather than the other way around. That's, I think, the key difference between centrism and the middle. And so what are some of those things? First of all, I think an embrace of complexity and nuance, an understanding that politics isn't simple. There isn't a 5-word slogan that really solves any of the major problems we face in the world today. A belief in equality of opportunity. So there are people who, I think particularly on the left, who believe in equality of outcome, the idea that we should strive for everybody to get to exactly the same place. And there are people on the right who say, we don't believe in equality at all, everybody should do whatever they manage to do, whereas centrists will always say it's about giving everybody the same opportunity, and then they choose to take it or not. That's already up to them. There's liberal patriotism, liberal nationalism, if you like, which says we can be proud of our country, we can be proud of our identity, our community, who we are, and connect that to liberal values. I think throughout the book you see an unswerving, unflinching commitment to liberal democracy, something which is sorely missing from too many places in democratic politics today, but a sense that those institutions are, and we can talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but those institutions that hold liberal democracy together are critical for the success that we see and the success that we want. And the other thing I would say about centrism, and again, this is something we can go into in a bit more detail a bit later on maybe, is it is fundamentally a hopeful political approach. Centrism talks about hope, talks in hopeful terms. And if you think of some of, I think, the most obvious centrist kind of figures that appear in the book a lot as well, Bill Clinton, perhaps one of the most successful campaigners we've seen in the modern era in politics. And what people remember from his election campaigns is this amazing 60-second ad called A Place Called Hope, which is about where he came from. Barack Obama turned hope into his entire first-term campaign strategy. People were going around with T-shirts that had the word hope written on them. I work for a party called Yesh Atid, which means there is a future. In essence, centrists are hopeful. And that, I think, is an enormous point of contrast with where so much of politics is today, which is the politics of fear and the division and hate. So I think those are some of the things that define political centrism, and you see throughout the essays in the book.
And one of the essays here talks about disinformation, which is one of several reasons why politics feels so polarized right now. Another reason might be social media, but a lot of disinformation happens through social media where it's quite tribal. It's us versus them. But someone here is quoting someone else. So it says Russian disinformation is not about positioning left versus right, but about using the left and right against the center. I think that says a lot about what it is. And for me, having read this book, it struck me that centrist is a broad church. It includes people who, as you say, accept kind of democratic norms. So centrists are not going to man the barricades of a revolution usually. They accept democratic norms and they accept facts. This seems to be a thing. You can have opinions, but you can't have your own facts. Another quote that I think is mentioned several times here. That seems quite important to me as well. In a post-fact or a post-expert world, is that an attraction perhaps to centrism, that we all accept certain norms? Things can change, things can be reformed one way or another, but the basis is there in a democracy, and there are certain scientific facts that we just can't make up another version of. So it's creating a place where you can have rational and meaningful and respectful debate. Is that the centre?
I think that's absolutely a part of it. One of the things you see with populist and illiberal leaders is they start to go after particular institutions. And where do they start to go? They go after the judiciary because it acts as a restraint. They go after the media and try to shut down independent media because it acts as a counterbalance, so it allows you to control the narrative. And often people don't notice, but they go after things like national statistics organizations, so they can actually control the flow of facts that come out, or adapt them, or change them, or alter them to create a reality that's more convenient for them rather than the reality that's actually out there. So yes, centrism embraces facts and embraces science and it embraces the rationality, but it has to do that with emotion. We can't separate those two things. And sometimes, you said, I think centrists are less likely to be manning the barricades in a revolution. Well, that's true, and I think centrists instinctively prefer a kind of a slower progress towards a better end goal and a constant progress. That doesn't mean that centrists can be without passion. And there are examples throughout the book, I think, where you see that. So Baroness Ruth Anderson, who's the CEO of Index on Censorship, writes very passionately about freedom of speech. And I think that's somewhere where centrists need to grab that agenda and say, we're the ones that protect freedom of speech. The right likes to talk about freedom of speech now, and they're very pro-freedom of speech, except when it comes to views they don't like. And the same is true, I think, on the far left. And that's a place where centrists say, wait a minute, we're the guarantors of freedom of speech, and we're going to protect that passionately. The same is true of liberal democracy. The same is true of the embrace of technology. The idea that we can wish AI away or wish technological progress away and hope it doesn't come, because it genuinely does create fear, because people are worried about the impact. So you can't wish it away, and so you have to embrace it and decide how you're going to manage it. And centrists can lead that fight, and they can do it passionately. And the other place where I think centrists need to be the most passionate voices are against the extremes. You often see these kind of pitched battles between the far right and the far left, but all that does is help both of the extremes. Whereas actually the ones who should be leading that charge should be centrists who say, we reject both of you. I have plenty of ability within me to say to the far left and the far right, you're both wrong. I have no time for either of you. And I think I'm going to push both of you outside and build a broad centrist church wherever I can that can actually manage the complex problems that we face today. And so while it's true that centrists by and large aren't revolutionaries, that shouldn't be confused with a lack of passion or a lack of intensity, to go back to Yeats's poem at the beginning.
It's mentioned several times in the book by the various authors that centrism has a brand deficit. Well, it's probably not even a brand until I think this book tries to establish centrism as a brand. And so some of them say, for example, balance and moderation and pragmatism, which are some of the things you're talking about, can be synonyms for the status quo. Basically, let's just leave things as they are, rumbling along. Also, another person said, I've never heard this phrase, but he talks about a centrist dad. So a bit like dad jokes are bad jokes. A centrist dad is only a notch above gammon or imperialist in terms of a slur. So for anyone with the passion for politics of the kind you're talking about, they might look at centrists and say, you don't have any passion. You just want things more or less as they are, and you don't want people shouting at each other from the extremes. I mean, how do you counter that notion? If centrism really is a thing that passionate people who want to engage in politics can identify with, how do you counter that brand deficit?
Well, I think that's part of the challenge, and that's part of what I hope the book addresses, and that's part of the message, I guess, of my conversation with you today and others, is to say we should be proud of that passion. We should be loud about it. We should be clear about it. Every political movement, every political group or approach has critics, and that's okay. And one of the things that was important to me in the book was we take those criticisms head on. We try and give them the seriousness that they deserve. Some of them, I think, deserve more seriousness than others. Philip Collins from The Spectator has written a whole piece answering the critics of centrism, and that's up front in the book, so you can see what the major criticisms are. It's a challenge today. Daniel Lubetzky, who's written one of the essays, the founder of Kind Snacks, and a big believer in centrism, I think, he says radicals wake up in the morning thinking about how to change the world. Moderates wake up in the morning thinking about what they're going to have for lunch. So part of our challenge is to change that and say, actually, if you care about the state of the world, then it's not enough just to think about lunch. You have to think about how you want to make the world better. Centrists absolutely aren't about status quo. I think the idea of pragmatism and moderation and nuance and complexity and seriousness in politics is as far from the status quo as possible right now, and that's one of the reasons we see so many challenges. Politics has gone to a place where we've lost those things, and we need them. And it is more difficult. It's harder to get people excited about something that's more complicated in a tweet or in a 5-word slogan than it is about a simple solution or something divisive. And we see the algorithms of social media. Now, if you're a political actor, you have two choices. You can complain about it and say how terrible it is, and that's okay. Or you can try and do something about it and say, well, we're going to try and take that on and challenge it. And I mentioned this before, but I think it's one of the most important ways that centrists can do that. And that is to say, if populists and extremists try to govern and try to campaign through fear, there's no point us competing with that. We're never going to be able to out-fear them. And so what we should be doing is offering an alternative, and that alternative is a message of hope. And the message of hope says, Rabbi Sachs, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, I think one of the great philosophers and writers, and I quote him in the introduction to the book as well, talks about hope as opposed to optimism. Hope is an active virtue. And so hope is our antidote to fear. We go out and we say, actually, we believe in human nature. It's not naive, but we believe that people have the ability to make the world better if they choose to. We can give people that hope about where the world is going, where their country is going, about where things can progress to that's better, rather than try to scare them about how terrible the other side is or how everything's falling apart.
So how do you do that? Because you've already acknowledged that the extremes or the one-issue parties are quite successful in communication.
Yeah.
Several essays in your book mention things like patriotism, you've just mentioned it as well, and tradition, things that are probably seen as the reserve of what we call the right wing. Also identity politics. I don't know when that phrase emerged, but that's become something unavoidable now, perhaps on the left wing more. But they're quite similar things. It's who you perceive yourself to be, I think, we could call it tribal as well. But I think you and some of the contributors here acknowledge it's kind of fair enough to feel you are part of a group or a part of a history or a tradition. And that's something some of your writers say, don't reject that, embrace it, but in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a difference between, I think, a core difference between patriotism and nationalism. The idea of patriotism, that you love your country, that you're proud of it, you're proud of its history and its traditions and its cultures, as opposed to nationalism, which tends to be outward-looking, and how much better you are than others. And Orwell writes in his notes on nationalism defines that brilliantly. So one of the things about centrism, one of the things in this book is that I'm not willing as a centrist to give up on patriotism to the right. Centrism, patriotism doesn't belong to the right. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to them. I think it's a centrist virtue. And so just like we shouldn't give empathy to the left as something that only the left cares about people, only the left worries about people who are worse off, neither should we give up on patriotism to the right. The centre can say, those are our values and we'll fight for them. We'll do it in a better way, in a more productive way. Tony Blair and New Labour in the 1990s talked about New Labour, New Britain, called Britannia. The whole ecosystem around New Labour was a pride and a patriotism in Britain, and embracing that as a positive thing. I do think that's very natural. People do feel a connection to their local community. People do feel a connection to their country, and we shouldn't try to take that away. There's no reason to it. It's an incredibly positive, motivating factor for people, and something that people have a right to be proud of. So I think when you combine that and you say, it's also okay to say our national history can be complicated. Our national history might have things in it that are difficult, and we can acknowledge them, and we can adapt our national identity to welcome in new people. I grew up in a city called Leicester in England. Leicester when I was there, had a huge Indian population, and it enriched the city. We used to do Diwali and Christmas and Hanukkah celebration, lighting lights in the streets together, because they were three festivals that were associated with lights. Those things can enrich a place rather than weaken it, and still keep a national identity, keep a sense of things that people are proud of. And I think I'll give examples of that for different countries. So we do have an ability to take those positive attributes, those positive values, and claim them as our own. And you see it again in some of the people I mentioned earlier. Bill Clinton's campaign was full of hope. Tony Blair's campaign was full of hope. JFK's campaign was full of hope. So I think you take political campaigns and you infuse them with a really positive message, and you get the attention like that. There's an advert that I always like to give as an example, and again I think it's in the book as well. But of the two candidates for governor of Utah, did a campaign ad together where they stood next to each other and talked about how being from Utah is about respecting each other and about still being neighbors and still working together. Both of them said, I want you to vote for me. I think I'm the better candidate, and I think I'm right, and I think they're wrong, but we can do that standing next to each other and still be friends. They took a sense of local pride, took it into their political message. And one of the fascinating things was when you polled people and you surveyed people afterwards, people who saw that advert were less likely to support political violence. They were less likely to reject election results because they saw two opposing candidates who were able to stand next to each other. Now, you can't always do that. There are times when a centrist candidate is up against an extremist candidate who isn't going to stand with you and deliver a hopeful message. But there are ways around that, and I think that's the core approach that we should be taking.
Talking of the UK, for example, we have a parliament that is not a semicircle. It's got two banks facing off each other, and the same could be said about the US Congress, although it is in a different shape. Basically, you've got one side versus the other, and some would say this very combative form of politics is actually a good form of democracy. I've often had my doubts about that, but there's no way you would change overnight that form of politics, which exists in many mature democracies, which, when they're at their best, work fairly well as democracies, but they're still combative and antagonistic. Do you think it's time to revisit that for some of those countries?
I don't want to portray centrism as an attempt to bring everybody together. Right? It's okay that there are differences. There are centrists in the Labour Party and in the Conservative Party, in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in Labour and the Liberals in Australia. There are centrists who exist across different political parties, and that's a positive thing. And it's okay that they fight and they argue and they try to come out. In Judaism, there's a concept of an argument for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. The idea being that you argue, and it's okay. The argument in and of itself is positive if the goal is to achieve a better result. And you see models that overcome it. In Congress, you have the the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is Democrats and Republicans that come together. And they've been a key player in passing some of the biggest bipartisan pieces of legislation in recent years because they say there are problems that we can work together on. Now, you point out the physical way in which people sit, and I think that's true, and there's an element of something that's problematic in that. But what we actually see is that politics isn't a spectrum. It's not the left here and the right here. It's a horseshoe. And the extremes are the ones who are furthest away from the center. The more you can broaden out the center, the more the center can dominate politics, the more you can have those arguments and have them be positive, have them be a place for real deliberation about serious issues that it's okay to disagree on. Not everybody feels the same about some of the most sensitive and complicated issues that we face. One of the essays in the book by Polly Bornstein talks about the idea of moving us from binary thinking to a spectrum. So to say, rather than trying to say, I'm for or against something, try to put yourself on how far you are or aren't willing to accept, how far you're willing to go. And then you find that there's room for compromise. When you put people in a position where they have to be either for or against something, then it makes it much harder to break down some of those barriers. The centrism that I envisage is a strong centrist faction in systems that have two parties, two strong centrist factions that play two key roles. The first is they say to their party leader, without me, you can't get anything done. You don't have to listen to the radicals in the party because I'm a bigger faction, I'm a stronger faction, and if you don't listen to me, you won't get any of your agenda through because this is what I demand. Ideally, the leader is also from that group within a party, but if not, at least they're strong enough. And the other thing is they can reach out to the other side and say, where can we find areas of agreement? Where can we build some kind of consensus that allows us to move forward? I think that should be the goal in two-party systems. In places where there are multi-party systems, centrists can build their own platform and drive it into the heart of the political system, as Macron did in France, or Nios in Austria, or Yesh Atid here in Israel. They created their own platform and said, this is the centrist platform in the country, and now we're going to try and rally as many people as possible behind it.
So some of those you mentioned are kind of recently emerging centrist political parties, but others you've mentioned, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton. Critics on the right or conservatives would say, oh yeah, so your version of centrism actually is this kind of social democratic. It's definitely not where the Republican Party is right now, or indeed the UK Conservative Party. How would you counter that you're talking about a kind of a soft left or a moderate left rather than, how does that differ from centrism?
So one of the good things about centrism is you get attacked often with exactly the same arguments from both sides. So you're right that the people on the political right, conservatives, look at centrism and say it's just basically a soft centre left. These social democrats who realize they can't get elected, and so they position themselves a little bit further in the center. At the same time, the left says, listen, these guys are basically just right-wing neocons dressed up as something more moderate in order to try to pull people away. So the argument comes at you from both sides. It's the same argument, and it's wrong on both counts. In two-party systems, yes, the centrist leader comes from one of the two major parties, but you look at someone like Macron, and he has pulled people together from both the socialists and the Republicans in France and brought them together into one party. So I think it doesn't really meet reality, but the criticism is always there, and it comes from both sides equally. Again, it's up to centrists to say, this is who we are, and we wear our badge proudly, and we aren't trying to dress up as somebody else, and we're also not willing to let you define who we are. Part of that is, again, the goal of the book is to say, here's a coherent argument for what we are. Here's how we approach lots of issues. Here's, by the way, how we are different. And there are plenty of things in the book that I think people on the left will find very difficult and will dislike. And there are equally things on the right that people on the right will find that they don't like. And that's, I guess, how we know that we're in a different place.
I asked you at the start of the interview kind of why now for this book. And a couple of the writers mention technology and the technological revolution that we've all lived through the last few decades, and we're probably at the start of a new one. Someone says the fourth industrial revolution, which is a term favoured by the World Economic Forum, is also a political revolution. Why is that?
So there's a few things I'd say about technology. First of all, it's a fundamental change in how societies operate and how societies work. So the idea that algorithms today might dominate what you see on your social media feed is a very easy example to understand how it can affect your politics. If you control the algorithm of Twitter or Facebook, you can control what people see, and you have an outsized influence on the political process. When we get to a place where technology can maybe suggest where constituency boundaries should be, that is inherently political. There will be a political element within that. So technology isn't just about the fact that we're advancing very quickly, but it has real effects on the political process. The second thing is it has an effect on the structure of society. More and more of us are working from home. This interview that you and I are doing would probably not have been possible 30 years ago, and we would have had to meet in person to do it. There's changes in how people work. There's changes in the kind of jobs that they have. Haley Stevens from Michigan talks about the shift that Michigan has to make now in terms of its industry. This is a state that is famous for building cars, and now it has to change its whole industry to something that's fitting for the modern world. So the impact of technology is so deep, and I don't think we understand it enough yet. It's so dramatic, both on the political process and on society, that it really is a political revolution. I think one of the challenges that we have with the pace of technology, and Jamie Susskind, who wrote the piece on technology and how we should think about governing technology, how we think about regulating technology, one of the major problems that we have is elected politicians, particularly older elected politicians, don't have a background in technology. They don't understand the pace of change. It's very difficult to keep up with the pace of change. Even for somebody of my age, the things that my children might be doing and I might be doing are already completely different. But we have to find a way to allow those that govern to have a deep enough understanding of technology to know how to help us regulate it, if at all, how to govern it, and how to bring it into society in a healthier way. It's a huge challenge that we face.
Are there other issues that you think cannot be solved without centrism? I think this book argues that centrism is necessary to maintain democracy. Without it, democracies can't function and will disappear. But are there also particular issues that we need centrism to achieve solutions for?
I think almost every issue. I think almost every political issue that you could think of, if you try to solve it with an extreme from one side or the other, it won't work. It requires a centrist solution to almost any of the big complicated issues that we face today, because there's so much complexity in those issues. But I'll give you one example that's maybe a really sensitive one, and one of the kind of hot button issues that's difficult for people. Lord Jonathan Evans, who was head of the UK security services, writes about centrism and counter-terrorism. If you ask the political right, particularly the far right, how to deal with terrorism, they'll tell you, crush it with force, as much force as possible, as much force as is needed, crush it completely. If you speak to people on the far left, there's a very intrinsic desire, I think, to understand the causes and where it comes from and why people feel that way. And maybe if we compromise with them a bit more, maybe if we give them a bit more, then they'll stop, with no sense that maybe people are driven by something else. If you don't approach something like the fight against terrorism with an understanding that you do need to use force, there is a need for force in that fight, and there is a need to try to deal with some of the underlying issues, create alternatives for people, deal with the challenges that people face, pull them away from extremism with things that aren't just military force, but also require diplomacy and governance and policy. You're never going to be able to deal effectively with a challenge like fighting terrorism and protecting national security. So I think, that's just the one example that I would take, but it's true for everything. Look at debates around healthcare, and you see that you need to find that kind of centrist solution. And one of the reasons I think why it's so important beyond the policies themselves, and this is something that maybe goes a little bit to process, but an example that I give people is centrists are inherently in favor of compromise. Why are we in favor of compromise? And I'll give it as an example if I was a political actor. If I have a policy that I believe in 100% and I can get it passed through my parliament, wherever I am in the world, with 51% of the vote, or I could water it down from 100% to 80%, and that allows me to broaden the support from 51% to 75%, I'll choose the second option. Not because I have to. I have a majority. I can pass exactly what I want. But because I think by broadening the consensus, by approaching it in a centrist way, by broadening the support for it, I do a few things. First of all, with modesty and humility, maybe the people who disagree with me have something to add to the conversation and to the solution that I haven't thought of. And maybe it's worth taking on board something that people other than me and my political camp think. Maybe there is something that we can learn from other people. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you don't build a consensus around something, if you don't build broad support around something, it won't last. The worst thing for public policy, for any issue you can take, infrastructure or healthcare or education, any issue you can think of, the worst thing is a constant dramatic shift from one side to the other. If I can build a broad consensus, I can build things that last. I can build things that will go beyond the time when I will lose the next election, because that's how politics works. There'll be times when I'm in power and times when I'm in the opposition. But if I build things that have a broader consensus, they will last beyond my term in office. That is much more likely to create long-term success.
Do you have any hope that this idea of centrism will take hold and will, as I think someone said, centrists need to take back control, to use a three-word slogan? Do you have any hope for that, for the future around the world?
I do, but I think part of my centrism and part of the centrism that comes out in the book is also a very pragmatic approach, which says that there isn't an end point. We're not working towards a utopia. It's a constant process. And so there will be times when the far right or the far left rise in power, rise in appeal. And by the way, and I should have said this earlier, some of the reasons that they rise to power are because of genuine fears that people feel, well-founded fears that people feel. That we shouldn't dismiss the reason that people support the extremes. Macron, in one of his first speeches, talks about the fact that we have to give you a reason to never vote for the extremes again. It's our responsibility to give you the answers that are better than their answers and that pull you away from it. But that isn't us judging people who feel the way they feel, because the fears are understandable. Fears of technology, fears around immigration. I understand why people feel those things, and it's up to us to try to provide better solutions that work. But part of it is an understanding that it's a constant process. And if you want centrism to be successful, you need to build something that has deep roots. You need to build something that lasts. You need to build political parties that have a broad base of support. You need to understand that there'll be times when you're up and times when you're down. And you need to keep going and keep fighting it. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of the extremes from politics. I don't think we're ever going to be able to completely rid ourselves of populist leaders. But the idea, the challenge is to constantly keep going to try to maintain as much support for what we believe, for what I believe is the right approach to politics.
The book is called The Centre Must Hold. It's really, really fascinating. I think if you've got any interest at all in politics and democracy, and in some ways philosophy even, there's going to be something in this book for people to read. Yair Zivan, thanks very much for joining us on Radio Davos.
Thank you very much.
Yair Zivan. You can read the chapter from his book written by World Economic Forum President Birger Brender on the forum's website. It's called Why a Centrist Approach Can Restore Global Cooperation. Links to that in the show notes to this episode. Radio Davos is available wherever you get podcasts. Please follow or subscribe, and please leave us a rating or a review. That will help others find it. As would linking to Radio Davos on your social networks. I would be very grateful. Also, we post about podcasts on the World Economic Forum Podcast Club. Find that on Facebook. This episode of Radio Davos was written and produced by me, Robin Pomeroy. Studio production was by Taz Kelleher. We'll be back next week, but for now, thanks to you for listening, and goodbye.